I can still feel the weight of that day pressing against my chest as if it just happened yesterday. It was supposed to be a celebration, one of those bright family occasions where everyone dresses up, smiles for the camera, and pretends the world is perfect. My cousin's graduation was a milestone for him, and the entire family gathered in their best clothes, eager to capture every second on camera. The air buzzed with chatter, pride, and the sound of laughter bouncing around the banquet hall. For most people, it was a day to be remembered forever. For me, it became the day I finally realized how disposable I was in my own family. I stood at the edge of the crowd, a plastic cup in my hand, my fingers gripping it so tightly that I thought it might crack. I told myself I was simply shy, that it was my nature to stand off to the side and watch. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wasn't just shy. I had been trained to believe I didn't belong. And on that day, surrounded by proud smiles and camera flashes, that truth felt sharper than ever. As the graduates were called one by one, cheers filled the air. Parents rushed forward to take photos, aunts and uncles clapped, cousins exchanged hugs. Everywhere I looked, there were arms thrown around shoulders, faces pressed together in snapshots that would decorate living rooms and family albums for years to come. I tried to join in, stepping toward the group when the photographer gathered everyone for a big family photo. But even as I moved closer, I felt it, the silent push to the sidelines, the glances that didn't invite me in, the invisible rope pulling me back. I stood there, plastering a smile across my face while inside I crumbled. The sting was not new. It was an echo of every holiday where my presence was tolerated but never welcomed. Every birthday where my chair at the table seemed like an afterthought. Every gathering where I hovered at the edges while my cousins stood proudly at the center. The photo that day was just another reminder that no matter how much I wanted to belong, I never truly did. I remember staring at the flashes of the camera, the way everyone leaned into each other, the sound of their laughter echoing louder than my own heartbeat. My body was in the room, but my spirit felt absent, erased before the picture was even printed. I could already imagine the framed photographs that would hang in my relatives' homes, full of joy, unity, and family pride. And I could see myself missing from them, as if I had never existed at all. That moment didn't just sting. It broke something open in me. For years, I had told myself that if I stayed quiet, if I worked hard, if I made myself small enough, one day I would finally be invited to take up space in the family story. But standing at the edge of that photo, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. They had already written me out. I left the celebration that day with a hollow ache in my chest, the kind that words cannot fully describe. Yet, even in the middle of that ache, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I wondered if maybe I was chasing belonging in the wrong place. Maybe I didn't need their approval to feel whole. Maybe, just maybe, I could write my own story instead of waiting to be included in theirs. And if you've ever felt erased from the picture of your own family, if you've ever stood at the edge pretending to smile while inside you broke apart, then you already know how heavy that moment feels. This is just the beginning of my journey, and it doesn't end where they tried to cut me out. Stay with me as I tell it. And before we continue, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Because this story, my story, is only just unfolding. When I think back to my childhood, it is not warm images of laughter and comfort that rise to the surface, but shadows. Long, heavy shadows that seemed to follow me into every room I entered, reminding me that I was different, that I was an intruder in my own bloodline. Some people talk about childhood as a time of innocence, a season of freedom before the world's burdens press down on their shoulders. For me, childhood was the weight itself. I was born into circumstances that set me apart before I even had a chance to breathe. My father left when I was too young to remember him. His absence was not spoken about directly, but it lingered in the air like a bad smell, present even when no one acknowledged it. My mother, left to raise me on her own, carried the silent judgment of her family like a chain around her neck. Every gathering reminded her, and therefore reminded me, that we were the ones who had failed, the ones who had broken the unspoken rules of pride and image that my extended family valued so dearly. From the earliest years, I sensed the difference. At birthdays, I watched my cousins open piles of gifts while mine arrived with a hesitation, a smaller bag placed on the table almost out of obligation. At Christmas, my cousins received hugs and cheers as they tore open their presents, while I unwrapped mine quietly, trying not to appear greedy or ungrateful, as though my very presence at the celebration was already too much. Even as a child, I could feel the tension, that my seat at the table was a courtesy, not a right. There is a particular pain in learning, too early, that love in your family comes with conditions. I learned to sit carefully, to lower my voice, to keep my needs invisible. I studied the expressions on my relatives' faces, noticing the tight smiles when my mother and I entered the room, the way conversations dimmed until we passed by. It was as though we carried a stain that never washed out, and no matter how hard I tried, I could not scrub it away. School became my escape, but even there, the shadow followed. My classmates would talk about family vacations, Sunday dinners with grandparents, the joy of being the favorite child or cousin. I listened quietly, pretending to understand, while a part of me withered inside. I never told anyone what it was like to walk into a family gathering and feel like an unwelcome guest, to spend holidays in houses filled with laughter that never truly included me. Instead, I smiled and nodded because explaining it would have only deepened my shame. As I grew older, the small exclusions turned into sharper reminders. Photos were a particularly cruel ritual. I can still remember being nudged out of the frame when the real family wanted a picture together. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but eventually I understood the message. These moments were meant to last forever, and they did not want me in the forever part of the story. I became the one who offered to take the pictures, holding the camera so I wouldn't have to face the rejection of being cropped out later. That habit stayed with me for years. The person behind the lens, never the one in the memory. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had mastered invisibility. I became quiet, reserved, the child who did not make waves. I told myself it was safer that way. If I didn't draw attention, I wouldn't give them another reason to remind me that I wasn't enough. I poured myself into my studies, convincing myself that achievement could be my ticket to acceptance. Maybe if I excelled in school, maybe if I proved my worth, they would see me differently. But even as I earned awards, even as teachers praised me, the family's indifference remained steady. My successes were never celebrated the way my cousins were. I was still the shadow in the corner, the reminder of something they'd rather forget. The cruelty of it all was not in the words spoken, but in the words withheld. Rarely was I openly insulted. Instead, I was erased. My name was left out of stories. My presence went unacknowledged. I was not teased, I was ignored. And somehow, that silence cut deeper than any insult could have. Insults at least recognize your existence. Silence tells you that you are not even worth noticing. My mother, for her part, tried her best. She loved me fiercely in private, but in front of her family, I could see her shrinking, just as I did. She wanted their approval as badly as I did, and she carried her own shame like a cloak. I used to watch her face at gatherings, how her smile faltered when my uncles praised her siblings but skipped her, how her eyes dimmed when her brothers and sisters compared their children's successes but left mine unspoken. In her silence, I learned my own. We both learned to endure. Endurance became my survival skill. I learned to hold my breath in rooms where laughter flowed around me but never toward me. I learned to lower my expectations until they nearly vanished, convincing myself that wanting love from them was a kind of weakness. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to harden myself, a part of me still ached. A child never stops longing to belong, no matter how many times they are told they don't. When I look back now, I realize how much of my identity was shaped in those years. I became someone who measured worth by proximity. How close I was allowed to stand in the photo, how often my name was spoken, how many times I was invited into the laughter. And because I was always kept at the edges, I grew up believing that was where I deserved to stay. That was the foundation of my life, a childhood built on shadows. By the time I reached adulthood, I had already internalized the lesson that would haunt me for years. I was not meant to be part of the picture. By the time I entered my teenage years, silence had become both my shield and my prison. I had already learned that speaking too much, drawing attention to myself, or trying to insert my voice into conversations often led to discomfort, dismissal, or worse, the cold recognition that my words carried no weight in my family. So I chose silence, not because I wanted it, but because it felt safer. I became the child who blended into the background, the one whose presence was easy to overlook. In classrooms, I excelled academically, and teachers praised my discipline. But outside of those walls, at family gatherings and social settings, I became invisible. I learned to lower my eyes, to nod at the right moments, to keep my laughter soft and brief so it wouldn't draw attention. It was as though I had enrolled in a lifelong performance, the role of the quiet one, the one who wouldn't disrupt the delicate image my relatives tried so hard to maintain. The truth is, I wore silence like armor, but inside, I was burning. I longed for acknowledgement, for someone to see me, to pull me out of the corners I had been pushed into. But every time I thought I might try, every time I gathered the courage to step forward, the sting of exclusion reminded me of my place. It was easier to shrink than to face the humiliation of being reminded I was never meant to stand at the center. My teenage years became defined by this constant performance. At family dinners, I would sit quietly, listening as my cousins spoke proudly about their sports victories, their honors, their weekend adventures. My achievements, though equally valid, were met with polite nods or ignored altogether. It was as if no matter what I accomplished, I was destined to remain in the shadows. That is the cruelty of favoritism within families. It does not just elevate one child, it diminishes another. And I was the diminished one, the muted note in a symphony that celebrated everyone else's triumphs. I convinced myself that the silence was my fault, that if only I could be better, brighter, more impressive, then maybe I would finally be invited into the spotlight. So I buried myself in my studies, chasing perfection with a desperate hunger. Books became my refuge. In them, I discovered worlds where outsiders became heroes, where forgotten characters rose to shape destinies, where belonging was found in unexpected places. Those stories whispered to me that there was life beyond the walls of my family, though at the time, it felt like a distant dream. I copied that resilience into my own routine, pushing myself to win awards, to achieve marks that were impossible to ignore. And yet, even as certificates collected dust on my bedroom wall, they did not earn me the validation I craved. In school, I learned to present myself as competent and composed, but at home, the silence only deepened. My relatives praised my cousins for their natural charisma, their beauty, their effortless way of belonging. I was the one who worked too hard, who seemed desperate, who was always trying too much. That label clung to me like a second skin. The one who was never enough, yet always accused of wanting too much. So I mastered the role of the silent observer. I became good at reading the room, at sensing shifts in tone, at anticipating rejection before it happened. I could feel the moment when laughter would turn to discomfort if I lingered too long in a conversation. So I would excuse myself before the sting came. I could see the way a family photo was being framed and step out of the frame before anyone had to tell me I didn't belong in it. This self-erasure became my survival skill. But the tragedy of playing the silent role is that after a while, You forget where the role ends and where you begin. I began to wonder if silence was my true nature, if invisibility was simply who I was meant to be. The line between choice and conditioning blurred, and I could no longer tell if I was shrinking by force or by habit. At times, I would catch my reflection in the mirror and not recognize the person staring back. The hollow eyes, the tight shoulders, the lips pressed shut. I was not the child who once laughed freely, who once believed that love was unconditional. I was someone molded by rejection, someone who had learned to measure their worth by how little space they occupied. My teenage years should have been a time of exploration, of discovering passions and testing limits. Instead, they became a long rehearsal in disappearing. I measured my words, my steps, even my breaths, afraid of being noticed in the wrong way. I spent nights lying awake in bed, replaying moments where I could have spoken up but didn't, where I could have asked for what I needed but swallowed it down instead. Each time, I told myself I was protecting myself, but really, I was losing pieces of myself, bit by bit. The role of silence was not freedom. It was confinement. But at the time, I didn't know that. At the time, I thought silence was survival. And maybe it was. Without it, I might have broken under the weight of constant rejection. But in choosing silence, I also built walls so thick that even I could no longer hear my own voice inside them. Looking back now, I can see how those years shaped me. They taught me to endure, yes, but also to disappear. They taught me to study others but never reveal myself. They taught me that love was something you had to earn, and no matter how hard you tried, you might never be worthy of it. That was my teenage life. A performance of invisibility, a survival act dressed up as humility. And though it kept me safe from the sting of constant rejection, it also buried me deeper into the shadows. When I left for college, I thought I was finally escaping the weight of my family's shadow. For the first time, I was living away from them, breathing air that wasn't tainted by constant reminders of where I didn't belong. The distance felt like a door opening, a chance to reinvent myself. I told myself that in a new city, among new people, I would no longer be the silent shadow. I would finally step into the person I had always wanted to be. At first, it seemed possible. On campus, nobody knew me as the quiet cousin, the forgotten child, the one who hovered at the edges of photographs. I was simply another student, free to shape my own identity. I joined clubs, sat in classrooms where my name was just a name, not a reminder of family disappointment. For a brief moment, I felt the stirrings of belonging, not the kind that was reluctantly handed to me, but the kind I was building on my own. But the cracks began to show almost immediately. No matter how far I moved, the conditioning of my childhood clung to me. I still measured every interaction, still hesitated before speaking, still worried that my presence was an intrusion. Even when surrounded by strangers who had no reason to exclude me, I carried the invisible scars of exclusion. I laughed too carefully, contributed cautiously, and often chose silence over the risk of rejection. And then, of course, there were the family gatherings I still attended. Holidays, birthdays, graduations, the cycle of events where I was expected to show up, smile, and play my part in the family's staged performance of unity. Each time I returned home, I stepped back into the role I had rehearsed all my life. I would sit at the table, contribute little, and watch the spotlight shine on everyone else. My cousin's achievements filled the air like confetti, celebrated with claps, toasts, and admiration. Mine were acknowledged briefly, then pushed aside as though they had already been forgotten. I remember one holiday where I had just finished my first year of college with honors. I had worked myself to exhaustion, pouring everything I had into proving I was capable, hoping maybe this time my family would see me differently. When I returned home, I carried my pride like a fragile flame, desperate to protect it. But in the living room filled with chatter and laughter, My news slipped into the conversation and disappeared without impact. Within minutes, attention turned back to my cousin's athletic achievements, and my voice once again drowned in the noise. That was the pattern. My victories always paled in comparison to theirs, not because they were smaller, but because they came from me. In the eyes of my family, I was not meant to shine. I was meant to survive quietly while others dazzled. The cracks in my smile grew deeper with every ignored moment, every erased acknowledgement. Even the photos followed me into adulthood. At each gathering, when cameras came out, I still felt the same hesitation from childhood. Where should I stand? Would I be included this time? I often positioned myself at the edge of the frame, ready to be cropped out later, already accustomed to vanishing. Sometimes I volunteered to take the picture, avoiding the sting altogether by erasing myself before anyone else could. Those photos, framed and displayed in relatives' homes, carried the same message they always had. This is our family, complete without you. It wasn't just the gatherings that reminded me of my place. It was the subtle, constant reminders that I was different. The way my family praised our children while leaving me out of the plural. The way jokes were made about bloodlines, about who carried on the family's pride, with an unspoken understanding that I did not. The way glances shifted whenever my mother and I entered the room, as if our very presence unsettled the fragile image of perfection they wanted to project. College gave me distance, but it didn't give me freedom. I returned from campus carrying invisible chains, still bound to the patterns that had shaped me since birth. I told myself I didn't care, that I was stronger now, that their opinions couldn't touch me, but each visit home proved otherwise. No matter how much I tried to build a new identity, the old one pulled me back like quicksand. I would leave gatherings exhausted, my smile aching, my chest heavy with the same emptiness I had carried since childhood. And yet, beneath the cracks in the smile, something else was beginning to form. The older I grew, the more I started to see the truth clearly. It wasn't that I was unworthy. It wasn't that I lacked value. It was that my family had chosen not to see it. Their blindness had become my cage, but it was not the truth of who I was. That realization came slowly, flickering at first like a dim light in the distance. But even the faintest light can pierce through long shadows. College gave me glimpses of what life could be beyond their approval. Friends who celebrated my victories, professors who encouraged me, spaces where my name was not forgotten. Those glimpses gave me strength, though I didn't yet know how to use it. For now, I still returned home, still wore the cracked smile, still carried the weight of invisibility. But something deep inside me had begun to shift. The cracks in the mask were growing, and soon the silence I had lived in for so long would no longer be enough to contain me. The day of my cousin's graduation marked more than just another family gathering. It became the breaking point, the moment when the weight of years finally collapsed on top of me. I had lived so long in silence, shrinking into the background, convincing myself that endurance was enough. But that day, standing at the edge of celebration, I realized endurance had become suffocation. The hall was filled with applause and flashes of cameras, the kind of noise that drowns out any chance of quiet reflection. My family laughed, embraced, and congratulated one another with unrestrained joy. I tried to stand tall, to let the rhythm of their celebration carry me along, but the familiar ache in my chest only grew heavier. It was the same ache I had carried since childhood, the ache of being present yet unseen, of existing on the margins of every important moment. When the photos began, I felt the sting most sharply. Families posed in clusters, smiling so brightly their cheeks must have ached. I positioned myself at the edges, as I always had, prepared to fade into the background. But in those moments, it struck me that I wasn't just being placed on the margins of a photograph. I had been placed on the margins of my family's story altogether. It was as if every small cut over the years, the ignored birthdays, the overlooked achievements, the silences that weighed more than words, had been adding up quietly, layering upon one another. And now, at this graduation, the layers pressed down all at once, crushing me beneath their weight. I could no longer pretend the hurt was something I could carry. For so long, I had convinced myself that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, smiled wider, I might one day earn a seat at the table that had never been set for me. I thought love was something I could win, that belonging was a prize to be earned through sacrifice and submission. But that day, surrounded by people who celebrated each other while erasing me, I finally saw the truth. Nothing I did would ever be enough. The family had already written me out of their story, and I had been spending my life begging for an invitation that would never come. I left the event earlier than anyone noticed. I walked out of the hall into the evening air, my chest heavy, my hands trembling. The night felt colder than it should have for the season, or perhaps the cold came from within me. As I walked home, tears blurred the lights of the city, turning them into smears of brightness I could not reach. I kept replaying the years in my mind. The moments when I stood on the outside, the photographs I wasn't in, the silences that screamed louder than words. By the time I reached my room, I was exhausted. I sat on the edge of the bed, my body trembling from the storm inside me. I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years, each sob carrying with it the weight of exclusion, humiliation, and longing that had been bottled up for so long. The tears weren't just about the graduation, they were about everything. About the child who learned to disappear, the teenager who swallowed their words, the adult who still carried the same wound. But even in that storm, something shifted. Somewhere between the sobs and the silence that followed, I realized that the ache came not from being unwanted, but from refusing to accept that reality. I had been trying to mold myself into a shape that would never fit the frame my family had built. And in that realization, the question formed clearly for the first time. What if I stopped trying? It terrified me, the idea of letting go of the pursuit of their approval. For so long it had been the compass guiding me, even if it always pointed toward disappointment. Without that, who was I? But another part of me whispered that perhaps I could build a new compass, one not dependent on being accepted by people who had never truly seen me. That night, I didn't have all the answers. I was still raw, still broken, still weighed down by years of rejection. But the breaking point had come, and with it, a quiet truth I could no longer ignore. I could not keep living in the margins of their story. I needed to begin writing my own. Leaving the graduation early might have seemed like a small decision to anyone else, but for me, it was monumental. It was the first time I had chosen not to endure, not to sit through another evening pretending to belong. As I slipped out quietly into the night, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me, but alongside it came something unfamiliar, a sense of release. For once, I had removed myself before they could erase me. That walk home was heavy with reflection. Every step replayed memories of times I had stayed when I should have left, moments when I had sacrificed my own peace in the name of appearances, nights when I returned from gatherings feeling hollow and unseen. The graduation was just another scene in a lifelong play, and I was tired of performing. The applause, the laughter, the endless photographs, they were illusions of closeness, backdrops against which I had always been the forgotten figure. When I closed the door to my room that night, silence surrounded me. But it wasn't the suffocating silence of family dinners where I dared not speak, nor the silence of being ignored while others were celebrated. This was different. This silence belonged to me. It was emptier, yes, but it was mine. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, feeling the ache of years pressing against my chest. For hours, I sifted through memories I had buried. The birthday parties where my gifts were smaller. The photographs where I was absent. The countless times my mother and I exchanged quiet glances of shared disappointment. Each memory felt like a stone added to a pile I had been carrying on my back. That night, for the first time, I asked myself why I was still carrying it. Walking away from them did not mean I stopped loving them. It meant I had begun to love myself enough to recognize the cost of staying. Each gathering chipped away at me, each dismissal carved deeper into my skin. I realized that if I kept returning, if I kept offering myself to people who only tolerated me, I would one day disappear completely. Not just from their photographs, but from myself. In the days after the graduation, I noticed how deeply ingrained my patterns were. When my phone buzzed with messages, I felt a surge of anxiety, bracing for the unspoken pressure to return to the cycle. Even when the messages were polite, even when there was no direct insult, the undertone remained. I was expected to show up, to smile, to play my part. Choosing not to answer immediately was terrifying. Choosing not to explain myself felt rebellious. Yet, each act of hesitation became a small step toward freedom. I began to spend more time alone, rediscovering the quiet I had always feared. For the first time, I wasn't using silence as a shield. I was using it as space to think, to breathe, to hear my own voice again. I read books that spoke of resilience, journaled thoughts I had never dared to write, and allowed myself to imagine a life beyond the family that had defined me. The more I imagined it, the more possible it began to feel. But walking away is not a single act. It is not slipping out of a graduation hall or ignoring one phone call. It is a series of choices, small and terrifying, that accumulate until you realize you have built a path. I stumbled many times. I still answered when I shouldn't have, still attended gatherings that left me drained, still smiled for pictures I knew I would be cropped out of. But with each stumble came a new awareness. I began to see that I was not powerless. I could choose when to leave, when to say no, when to preserve myself. There was grief in the process. Grief for the family I never truly had. Grief for the love I had begged for but never received. Grief for the years I had spent convincing myself to endure what was slowly destroying me. But beneath the grief, there was also relief. I had spent my life waiting to be chosen. And now, for the first time, I was choosing myself. Walking away was not a grand declaration. It was not a dramatic farewell or a slammed door. It was quiet, subtle, and deeply personal. It was the act of reclaiming the pieces of myself I had given away in the hope of being accepted. It was realizing that absence could be an act of survival, that leaving could be an act of love. Love for myself, love for the person I was still becoming. That chapter of my life did not end neatly. The ties to my family were not cut overnight, and the longing for their approval did not vanish instantly. But a seed had been planted, a seed that whispered of another way to live. Walking away from them, even just a little, meant walking toward myself. And though I was still trembling, still uncertain, I knew this much. I could no longer endure the role of the shadow. The first step away had been taken, and with it came a truth I could not unsee. That survival was no longer enough. I wanted more. After years of shrinking myself to fit into a family that never truly saw me, I entered a season where I began to search for something different. It wasn't intentional at first. I didn't wake up one morning and decide I would build a new family out of strangers. But little by little, through friendships, mentors, and unexpected connections, I began to understand that belonging could be found outside of bloodlines. The first shift came in small ways. I started to notice the people who actually celebrated me, who listened without judgment, who noticed when I wasn't okay. For years, I had dismissed these moments, brushing them aside because I was so focused on earning the approval of relatives who withheld it. But once I took my first steps away from the toxic cycles of my family, I became more open to noticing the kindness around me. At school, classmates invited me into study groups and treated my thoughts as valuable. At work, colleagues acknowledged my effort and encouraged me. These were simple gestures, ones I might have overlooked before, but now they struck me deeply. They were reminders that I did not have to fight to be seen, that in some places, visibility was natural, not conditional. Friendships grew from these spaces. People began to enter my life who accepted me as I was, without demanding that I shrink or mold myself to fit. With them, I could laugh without analyzing the sound of my own voice, speak without rehearsing my words in my head, sit at a table without worrying whether my presence was an inconvenience. For the first time, I tasted what it felt like to belong. It wasn't always easy. Trust did not come naturally to me. I had spent too many years bracing for rejection, and the scars of exclusion ran deep. Even in safe spaces, I often second-guessed myself, convinced that it was only a matter of time before I was pushed aside again. But the difference was this. When the fear rose, these new people didn't confirm it. They stayed. They reached back. They welcomed me again and again until the walls I had built around myself began to crack. As these friendships deepened, I began to redefine what family meant. I realized that blood ties are not always bonds. Sometimes they are chains. Real family is built in love, in mutual respect, in the freedom to exist without apology. With my chosen people, I discovered joy in everyday moments. Meals shared in cramped apartments, late-night conversations that stretched into dawn. Celebrations that felt genuine because every person in the room truly wanted me there. These were not staged performances for appearances. They were real, raw, and healing. I started creating albums of my own. Photographs filled with faces that lit up when they saw me. Smiles that included me without hesitation. For years, I had dreaded being in photos because they only reminded me of where I didn't belong. But with these people, I found myself wanting to capture the moments, to freeze them in time. Not because they proved anything to anyone, but because they mattered to me. The more I invested in these relationships, the more I noticed the contrast with my relatives. At family gatherings, I had always felt like an intruder, tolerated but never embraced. With my chosen family, I felt invited, celebrated, cherished. The emptiness I carried for so long began to fill with something new. Not the conditional approval I had once begged for, but the steady, unconditional presence of people who saw me as enough. I will not pretend it was a simple transformation. There were nights I still longed for the impossible, still wished my relatives could offer me what my chosen family did. But with time, those longings grew quieter, replaced by gratitude for the life I was building. I learned that healing does not mean erasing the scars. It means creating new stories that remind you the scars are not the whole truth. Finding my own people was not about replacing my family. It was about redefining myself. It was about stepping out of the shadow and into spaces where I could finally stand without apology. For the first time, I wasn't simply surviving. I was living. And in that life, I found something I had been chasing all along: belonging. As I began to invest more deeply in the friendships and connections that nourished me, the distance between myself and my family grew clearer. At first, it was subtle. I missed a few gatherings, chose to stay on campus during the holidays, or politely declined invitations to events that I knew would leave me drained. Each decision felt like a quiet act of rebellion, but also a step toward survival. I thought perhaps they wouldn't notice, or if they did, that they wouldn't care. I was wrong. The pushback came gradually, and then all at once. What struck me was not the concern for my well-being, but the tone of accusation that seeped into every interaction. Suddenly, my absence was interpreted as arrogance. My choices to stay away were painted as evidence that I thought I was too good for them. The narrative they spun was not that I had been hurt, but that I was the one inflicting harm, betraying the very people who had always been there for me. It was strange to hear them describe themselves in that way. always there. For years, I had stood on the margins, silenced and excluded, yet now my distance was recast as abandonment. It was as though they were rewriting history to suit their own sense of pride, painting themselves as the long-suffering family members who had tolerated me, only to be repaid with ingratitude. Their words weren't about love, they were about control. The betrayal wasn't in their disappointment, it was in their refusal to acknowledge the truth. Instead of reflecting on the years of exclusion, they accused me of turning my back on them. Instead of seeing my absence as a response to pain, they framed it as selfishness. It was as though my very act of choosing myself was an attack on their carefully constructed image of unity. The louder they grew, the quieter I became. I had spent years defending myself in silence, and now, once again, I found myself retreating into that old role. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't submission. It was clarity. I began to see their reactions for what they were, attempts to pull me back into the cycle, to keep me bound to a role that no longer served me. Still, the accusations cut deep. I would lie awake at night, replaying their words in my mind, wondering if perhaps they were right. Was I abandoning them? Was I ungrateful? The guilt gnawed at me, not because I believed I owed them my presence, but because the longing for acceptance had not fully died. Even after everything, part of me still wanted to be wanted. That tension, the pull between freedom and longing, was its own kind of torment. What hurt most was the hypocrisy. These were the same people who had erased me from photographs, who had overlooked my milestones, who had treated my presence as an inconvenience. Yet now, when I began to remove myself from their orbit, I became the villain in their story. It was betrayal, yes, but not mine. The betrayal was theirs, for rewriting the narrative, for refusing to admit the ways they had wounded me, for demanding loyalty while offering none in return. In those moments, my chosen family became even more vital. When the accusations threatened to drag me back into shame, the people who truly knew me reminded me of my worth. They reminded me that distance was not abandonment, that boundaries were not betrayal, that protecting my peace was not selfishness. Slowly, I began to believe them. Slowly, I began to release the guilt. The pushback from my relatives did not end. If anything, it grew louder as my silence stretched longer. But each time I chose not to engage, I felt a little stronger. Each time I refused to explain myself, I reclaimed a piece of the voice I had lost. Their betrayal had taught me something important. I could not rely on them to see me clearly. I could not expect them to validate my pain or acknowledge my absence as necessary. The only validation I needed was the quiet certainty that I was finally protecting myself. The more I embraced this truth, the less power their accusations held. Their words still stung, but they no longer defined me. For years I had lived in fear of rejection. Now I understood that rejection had already happened long ago. What I was experiencing now was not rejection, it was retaliation. Retaliation against my refusal to keep playing a part in their carefully staged family portrait. And in that realization, I discovered something freeing. I did not need their permission to walk away. I did not need their blessing to build a new life. Their betrayal was painful, but it was also revealing. It showed me exactly what I had been running from and confirmed why I needed to keep moving forward. There came a point when I realized my life was no longer defined by the absence of my family, but by the presence of something new. The emptiness they had left behind, the silence they had wrapped me in, had slowly been replaced by laughter, joy, and memories of my own making. I had spent years being erased from photographs, standing at the edges of group portraits that were never meant to include me. But now, for the first time, I found myself captured at the center of moments that mattered. It began quietly, almost without me noticing. A friend snapped a picture during a late-night study session, the table cluttered with notebooks and empty coffee cups, all of us exhausted yet smiling. Another friend insisted on taking a photo of us cooking dinner together in a cramped apartment, smoke rising from a pan we had already burned, our laughter filling the air. These were not staged family portraits in polished clothes with forced smiles. These were raw, imperfect, and real. At first, I struggled to accept these images. Years of conditioning had taught me to avoid cameras, to hide behind the lens rather than stand in front of it. I was used to excusing myself, to offering to take the picture so I wouldn't have to risk being left out. But my new people didn't allow that. They pulled me in, not with force, but with genuine joy, as if my presence was as natural and necessary as the air they breathed. And slowly, I stopped resisting. Slowly, I allowed myself to be seen. One day, I looked through my phone and realized I had an album filled entirely with photos of moments I had actually lived in, not just hovered around. Birthday candles lit just for me, tables where I sat at the center instead of the edge, trips where my smile was wide and unrestrained. I realized these albums were proof of something I had always doubted. I was not hard to love. I had never been unworthy. I had simply been surrounded by people who refused to see me. The walls of my home began to reflect this change. Where once they had been bare, or filled only with the sterile achievements I clung to as proof of my worth, now they carried photographs of laughter, of hugs, of gatherings where I was not an outsider. Each frame felt like a declaration, a refusal to let my story be defined by the albums that had erased me. I was building new ones, filled with evidence that I belonged, not in the family I had been born into, but in the one I had chosen. These new albums were not just physical. They were etched into my memory, into the rhythm of my days. I remembered the sound of spontaneous road trips, the kind where no one cared where we ended up as long as we were together. I remembered long nights where secrets were shared under dim lights, where vulnerability was met with acceptance rather than judgment. I remembered laughter that echoed so hard my chest ached, laughter that reminded me of everything I had been denied but finally found. And yet, with every new memory, the contrast with my old life became sharper. I thought about the photographs I had been excluded from, the tables where I had been tolerated rather than welcomed, the birthdays where my name was spoken softly and quickly forgotten. Those memories still existed, but they no longer defined me. They became a backdrop against which my new life stood out more vividly. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. There was power in reclaiming the camera, too. Where once I had used it as a tool to erase myself, I now used it as a way to preserve what mattered. I began to take photos not to hide, but to remember. Not to fill a frame I didn't belong in, but to honor the spaces where I truly did. Each picture became a rebellion against the years of invisibility, proof that I was here, that I mattered, that I had built something worth remembering. The albums became a kind of healing ritual. When I felt the sting of my family's absence, I would flip through the images of my chosen family. The smiles reminded me that I had not been left behind. I had simply walked toward something better. The photos whispered a truth I had long denied. Belonging is not something you beg for, it's something you create. And in building these albums, I learned another lesson. It wasn't only about capturing joy, it was about creating spaces where I could show up fully, where others could too. I realized that my chosen family wasn't just healing me. I was also part of healing them. We were each other's proof that we didn't have to stay in the places that broke us. Together, we were writing a new story, one snapshot at a time. Looking at those albums now, I see more than just faces and smiles. I see resilience. I see a life reclaimed. I see a person who once believed they were destined to remain invisible, now standing in the light without apology. I see the journey from silence to laughter, from exclusion to belonging, from erased to embraced. And maybe the most beautiful part is this: these albums are still unfinished. There are pages left blank, Spaces waiting to be filled with more moments, more faces, more proof that I am not just surviving at the edge of someone else's picture. I am the center of my own. When I look back now, the story of my life feels divided into two very different albums. The first is one I never asked for, filled with missing faces, cropped edges, and shadows where I should have been standing. The second is the one I chose, bursting with color, laughter, and moments where I am fully present. The difference between the two is not just the people in the pictures, but the truth they reveal about belonging. For years, I believed belonging was something I had to earn. I thought if I was quiet enough, obedient enough, impressive enough, then my family would finally open their arms to me. I wore myself down chasing scraps of validation, thinking that if I tried just a little harder, one day I would be welcomed. That belief shaped my entire childhood and adolescence, carving into me the idea that love was conditional, that I had to beg for my place in the story. But the truth I have learned is this: belonging is not something you chase. It is not a prize handed to you when you finally meet impossible standards. Belonging is where you are embraced without performance, where you are wanted without condition. And sometimes, the people you are born into cannot offer that. Sometimes, the people who should be your foundation are the very ones who keep pulling the ground out from beneath you. The hardest part of my journey was accepting that my family would never be what I wanted them to be. That realization came with grief, heavy and suffocating. I grieved not just for what I had lost, but for what I never had in the first place. I grieved the childhood that should have been filled with warmth, the adolescence that should have carried encouragement, the milestones that should have been celebrated instead of ignored. Grief became my companion for a long time, whispering reminders of everything I had been denied. But grief has another side, and in time, I discovered it. To grieve is to acknowledge what mattered. It is to admit that love was important, that connection was essential, and that the absence of those things hurt deeply because they were worth having. Grief taught me that I was not broken for wanting love. I was human. And being human means needing connection. That truth freed me. It reminded me that if love and connection were things I needed, then I had the right to seek them in places where they actually existed. I no longer had to keep knocking on a locked door, waiting for it to open. I could walk away and find another home, one built not by bloodlines, but by choice. Building my chosen family was not easy. Trust had to be rebuilt, brick by brick, after years of erosion. Vulnerability had to be relearned, after years of silence. But each moment of acceptance stitched me back together, piece by piece. The laughter of my friends, the encouragement of mentors, the steady presence of people who didn't disappear when things became hard, these were the stitches that held me. Slowly, I became whole again. Now when I look at the albums of my life, I no longer see myself as the child erased from photos. I see myself as the adult who chose to create new ones. I see a person who once believed they would never belong, now surrounded by faces that light up when I walk into the room. I see resilience where there was once only emptiness. I see proof that belonging was never about earning. It was about finding the right people to stand beside. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: you do not need to beg for space at a table where you are only tolerated. You can build your own table, fill it with people who truly see you, and watch as it overflows with laughter, love, and acceptance. The scars of exclusion may never fully disappear, but they no longer define the story. What defines the story now is choice, the choice to walk away from what diminishes you and to walk toward what sustains you. There are still moments when the old wounds ache. A holiday passes, and I wonder what it would feel like to be truly included. A photograph surfaces from years ago, and I remember the sting of standing at the edge. These memories don't vanish. They are part of me. But now, they are not the whole of me. They are a single chapter, not the ending. The ending is this: I belong. Not because I forced my way into a picture where I wasn't wanted, but because I created my own. Not because my family changed, but because I chose myself. And in that choice, I found people who chose me too. That is the lesson of my story. That is the truth I carry with me now. And if you are listening to this, if you have ever felt erased, if you have ever stood at the edge of a photograph wondering why you weren't welcome in the frame, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not unworthy. You are not invisible. You are not too much or not enough. You are simply waiting to find the people who will see you, the people who will celebrate you, the people who will remind you that belonging was never something you had to earn. So build your own albums. Capture the moments that matter to you with the people who make you feel alive. Let your walls reflect your joy, not your rejection. Fill your story with chapters of laughter, love, and resilience. And never again let anyone convince you that you don't deserve to be in the picture. This is the lesson I leave with you. Belonging is not given. It is created. And once you begin to create it, no one can take it away. If my story resonated with you, if you saw pieces of yourself in my journey, share your thoughts with me. Tell me what you've overcome, what albums you are building for yourself. And don't forget to subscribe, because together, we can keep rewriting these stories. We can build a community where no one stands at the edge of the frame.